I want to tell you about a pattern I noticed while looking at the daily routines of 50 people. 25 of them were consistently building wealth, not getting rich overnight, not launching startups, just quietly accumulating more every single year. The other 25 were consistently struggling. Not because they were irresponsible people. Not because they were uneducated. And here's the part that really got my attention, not because they were earning significantly less money. Both groups were pulling in somewhere between $50,000 and $90,000 a year. Same neighborhoods. Similar lifestyles on the surface. But underneath, completely different financial trajectories. I kept looking for the big variable. The inheritance. The lucky investment. The second income. It wasn't there. What I found instead was smaller than I expected. It was in the mornings. And in the evenings. Specifically in the 6 hours that nobody pays either group for, the hours between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., and between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. Those hours, it turns out, are where everything gets decided. There's a line often credited to Aristotle that goes something like this: we are what we repeatedly do. He wasn't talking about money, but he might as well have been. Because wealth, for most people, isn't a windfall. It's not a moment. It's a slow accumulation of small decisions made consistently over a long time. James Clear wrote about this in Atomic Habits, that the gap between who you are and who you want to be is almost never about effort. It's about the systems running quietly in the background of your daily life. The habits you barely notice because they feel automatic. That's exactly what I found in this study. 10 habits. None of them dramatic. None of them require a higher salary or a finance degree or some unusual level of willpower. But compounded over months and years, they create a financial gap between two people earning the same income that is genuinely shocking to look at. The first one almost sounds too simple. 92% of the wealth-building group check their bank balance every single morning. Not their investment portfolio. Not their net worth spreadsheet. Just their bank balance. It takes about 2 minutes. They open the app, look at the number, and close it. That's the whole habit. The struggling group did something very different. 84% of them checked their accounts only when they had to, when they were about to make a purchase and weren't sure if they had the money, or when that low balance notification hit their phone and made their stomach drop. They checked from a place of anxiety, reactively, in moments of pressure. Behavioral economists have a name for what the struggling group was doing. They call it the ostrich effect, the very human tendency to avoid looking at financial information when we suspect it might be bad news. The logic feels protective in the moment. If I don't look, I don't have to feel bad. But what actually happens is that your spending continues without any anchor point. You make purchases throughout the day with no real sense of where you stand, and by the time you do look, the damage is already done. The wealthy group wasn't checking their balance because they enjoyed it. They were doing it the way a pilot checks instruments before takeoff, not because they expect something to be wrong, but because awareness is simply the baseline for anyone navigating on purpose. That 2-minute morning check keeps the number in your mind all day. It creates a quiet reference point that subtly shapes every small decision that follows. It doesn't feel like discipline. It feels like knowing. Now here's a habit that lives so deep inside daily life that most people have never once thought to question it. At some point around 6 or 6:30 in the evening, a question surfaces. What's for dinner? It sounds harmless. But that question, asked without a ready answer, is one of the most expensive moments in the average person's week. Because when you don't know the answer, hunger makes the decision. And hunger is not a careful financial planner. Hunger opens DoorDash. Hunger calls for pizza. Hunger drives to the nearest restaurant and orders more than intended because you're sitting there starving and everything on the menu looks reasonable. 76% of the wealth-building group planned at least 4 dinners per week in advance. Not gourmet meals. Not elaborate cooking projects. Just a default answer to that question before hunger got to ask it first. The struggling group, 81% of them, decided at mealtime. Every night. And the cost of that daily improvisation was between $450 and $600 more per month on food compared to the other group. That's not a small number. That's somewhere between $5,400 and $7,200 a year, spent not on better food, but on the convenience of not having thought about it earlier. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein wrote a book called Nudge, built around a deceptively simple idea that most human behavior isn't really chosen, it's defaulted into. The environment presents an option, and we take it because it's there. The wealth building group had engineered their default. When the question came, "What's for dinner?" the answer was already waiting. Chicken and rice in the fridge. Pasta that takes 20 minutes. The default was set. DoorDash never even entered the equation. This next one sounds almost embarrassingly obvious once you hear it. And yet the numbers suggest almost nobody is actually doing it. 64% of the wealth building group walked or biked for any errand that was under a mile away. The corner store. The coffee shop 3 blocks down. The pharmacy that's a 9-minute walk from the front door. They walked. The struggling group drove for 91% of those same trips. Not because they were lazy, again, I want to be careful here, but because driving is the automatic response. You need something, you get in the car. It's just what you do. What you might not have ever added up is what that automation costs. Gas for short trips burns disproportionately because the engine never reaches efficiency. Wear on the vehicle accumulates. Parking costs, even small ones, stack up. When you actually calculate the annual cost of driving everywhere under a mile, you're looking at somewhere between $1,200 and $2,400 a year. For trips you could have walked in the time it takes to find your keys. There's also a longer game being played here, the health compound. Lower medical costs, more consistent energy, fewer sick days. None of that shows up in a single month. But over a decade it becomes a meaningful number that most people never attribute to the habit of walking to the corner store. Here's one that carries a particular kind of irony. The wealth building group in this study read more than the struggling group. Significantly more. But they spent less on books. Considerably less. On courses, even more dramatically less. And the gap isn't explained by discipline or self-control, it's explained by a simple distinction they'd made that the other group hadn't. They separated the value of knowledge from the price of the container it came in. The struggling group had a familiar pattern. A business book purchased at an airport because the title felt urgent. A $200 online course added to cart at 11:30 p.m. after a YouTube rabbit hole made it feel essential. A masterclass subscription bought on a monthly deal that then renewed for 2 more years. The books got read to page 40. The course got to module 3. The masterclass opened once. Naval Ravikant has said something that stuck with me, that he treats books like blog posts. He reads until they stop being useful and then moves on without guilt, because the goal was never to finish the book. The goal was to get the idea. The wealthy group had internalized that. They used library cards. They used Libby, a free app that gives you access to audiobooks and ebooks through your local library. They bought used copies of books for $2. They found the core ideas on YouTube before deciding whether to go deeper. They valued what the knowledge did for them, not what paying for it said about them. The average savings from this habit alone came to between $600 and $1,200 a year. Not life-changing on its own. But it's also not the point is the mindset. The wealthy group had stopped confusing investment in themselves with the act of spending money on themselves. Now let's talk about cooking, not as a lifestyle choice, not as a virtue signal about eating clean, but as a purely financial behavior. The wealth-building group cooked more meals at home than the struggling group. And when you run the math at its most basic level, the gap is hard to ignore. The average home-cooked meal costs somewhere around $4 per person. The average restaurant meal, and this includes fast casual, not fine dining, runs closer to $16. That's a $12 difference per meal. If you cook just 5 more meals per week at home instead of eating out, that's $60 a week. Across 52 weeks, that's $3,120 a year. Put that $3,120 into an index fund every year for 20 years at a historically average return, and you're looking at somewhere around $138,000. From the decision to cook 5 extra dinners a week. Thomas Stanley and William Danko spent years studying actual millionaires for their book The Millionaire Next Door, and one of the things they found consistently was that high wealth accumulators live well below their means in ways that are invisible from the outside. They don't drive the nicest cars in the neighborhood. They don't eat at the nicest restaurants. They cook. They find this genuinely unremarkable because they've never confused lifestyle performance with financial security. The kitchen, in their world, isn't a room they avoid, it's where a meaningful amount of their net worth gets quietly built, one meal at a time. This next habit is one that I think most people intellectually agree with and almost nobody actually practices. 80% of the wealth-building group didn't touch their phone for the first 60 minutes after waking up. Not to check messages. Not to scan the news. Not to scroll. They use that hour for something physical, a walk, some movement, stretching. Or something mental, reading, planning the day, sitting with coffee before the noise began. The struggling group did something very different. 89% of them reached for their phone within 5 minutes of opening their eyes. Now here's the connection that most people miss entirely, because it doesn't seem financial at first glance. What does scrolling your phone in the first 5 minutes of the morning actually deliver? Think about it honestly. It delivers a comparison feed, other people's vacations, other people's purchases, other people's lives performing well. It delivers advertising, targeted, personalized, designed by people whose entire job is to create desire in you before your conscious mind has had a chance to establish its own agenda. It delivers anxiety, news, drama, notifications that make the world feel urgent and unstable. And anxiety, as behavioral economists have documented extensively, is one of the most reliable triggers of impulsive spending. We buy things to soothe discomfort. We buy things to feel in control. We buy things to reward ourselves for surviving a stressful morning. The emotional tone of your first hour is the emotional filter through which every decision you make for the rest of the day gets processed. The wealthy group understood this, not necessarily in those terms, but instinctively. They protected that hour the way you'd protect any resource that was quietly shaping everything downstream. Nir Eyal wrote in Indistractable that distraction is never really about the phone. It's about the internal emotional state the phone is being used to manage. The wealthy group had designed their mornings so that state didn't need managing, it was stable before the world got a chance to unsettle it. Here's a habit that sounds like budgeting but is actually something much more subtle and much easier. The wealth-building group tracked their expenses every day. Not in a complicated spreadsheet. Not in a budgeting app that requires 45 minutes to set up. A notes app. A piece of paper. Whatever was closest. At the end of each day, they wrote down what they spent. That's it. 3 minutes. No judgment attached. No rules being enforced. Just a record. The struggling group had a different relationship with their monthly spending. When asked to estimate it, most of them said something like, probably around $3,000, give or take. When the actual number was pulled, it was closer to $4,800. Not because they were reckless. Because they genuinely didn't know. The money had moved, through apps, through tap payments, through subscriptions they'd forgotten existed, and there was no accounting for where it went. Ramit Sethi has made this observation repeatedly in his work. Most people are not bad with money because they lack discipline. They're bad with money because they lack information about their own behavior. There's a principle in psychology called the observer effect, the idea that the act of measuring something changes it. When you start writing down every expense, you begin to notice things you genuinely cannot unnotice. That $340 a month on work lunches. That $85 on subscriptions you forgot you had. That $60 in ATM fees you're paying for no reason. The patterns don't require you to act on them immediately. They just sit there, visible, impossible to ignore, and over time, behavior shifts without any willpower required. You just stop making the same invisible choices once they've been made visible. This one is about time that most people have already written off as useless. The average commute in this country runs about 26 minutes each way. That's 52 minutes a day. 5 days a week. 50 weeks a year. Do the math slowly, that's 217 hours a year spent sitting in a car or on a train or on a bus, in a kind of suspended animation between where you were and where you're going. 72% of the wealth-building group was doing something with that time. Audiobooks. Podcasts built around skills they were developing. Courses broken into commute-sized pieces. Over 10 years, that's more than 2,000 hours of education consumed in a space that was otherwise just gone. The struggling group listened to music. To radio. Sometimes to nothing. None of that is wrong, but it is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Shane Parrish has written extensively about the idea that learning is the one compounding asset that doesn't depreciate, that the person who spends 10 years consistently learning in whatever margins they can find ends up in a fundamentally different place than the person who didn't, and that the gap widens every year. The Commute, for the wealth building group, was simply free university. They hadn't sacrificed anything to get it. Now we get to the habit that is perhaps the most emotionally complicated to talk about honestly. The wealth building group said no to roughly 3 out of every 5 social spending invitations. Brunch. The group trip to the beach. The birthday dinner at the restaurant where the bill gets split 12 ways and somehow comes out to $90 per person. The after-work drinks that become a $60 evening without anyone deciding it should be. They didn't say no because they were antisocial. They said no because they had, somewhere along the way, quietly separated the things they genuinely valued from the things they were attending out of social obligation. The average monthly cost of saying yes to everything in this income range runs between $400 and $600. Across a year, that's between $4,800 and $7,200 spent largely on experiences that, if you asked a week later, you might struggle to clearly remember. Vicki Robin wrote something in Your Money or Your Life that has stayed with me. She talked about money as life energy. Every dollar you spend represents some portion of your finite hours on this planet exchanged for something. The question she suggested asking about every purchase isn't, can I afford this, but, is this worth the life energy it cost? The wealthy group had internalized something close to this. They chose where their social energy went the same way they chose where their money went, with some degree of intention. The practical toolkit they used was simple. They hosted instead of going out. A dinner at home for 6 people costs $30 to $50. The same dinner at a restaurant costs each person $50 to $80. They suggested free alternatives, walks, parks, movies at home, without drama or lengthy explanations. And when they did say no to something, they said it without guilt, without over-explaining, sometimes just honestly, I'm watching my spending this month. That sentence, it turns out, most people respect far more than they fear. The last habit on this list is the one that surprised me most when I first looked at the data. 88% of the wealth building group consistently slept 7 or more hours a night. Only 49% of the struggling group did. At first glance that looks like correlation without causation. Maybe wealthier, less stressed people simply sleep better because they have fewer worries. But when you look at the mechanism, the direction of causation starts to feel less obvious. Matthew Walker, who spent years studying sleep science and wrote Why We Sleep, has documented in careful detail what sleep deprivation does to human decision-making. It's not subtle. It reduces the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for weighing long-term consequences, resisting immediate temptation, and evaluating risk. When that part of the brain is running below capacity, the impulsive, emotional, short-term reward-seeking parts of the brain become disproportionately influential. One study found that sleep-deprived people spend 18% more on food than well-rested people, not because they were hungrier, but because their judgment about what was reasonable had quietly eroded. Think about the financial decisions that get made in a state of tiredness. The impulse purchase at 11 p.m. when your resistance is low. The forgotten bill that you kept meaning to pay but never got around to because your brain was in survival mode. The default subscription that renewed because canceling it felt like too much effort. The negotiation you didn't push back on because you didn't have the mental energy for friction. These are not dramatic financial events. They're small, quiet erosions, and they happen every day when you're not sleeping enough. Your sleep quality, it turns out, is directly connected to your spending quality. So here's where this leaves us. 10 habits. None of them requires earning more money. None of them requires an unusual personality type or an unusual tolerance for deprivation. What they require is something closer to attention, a slow, deliberate noticing of the daily defaults that are currently running on autopilot in the background of your life. The natural instinct after hearing a list like this is to try all 10 at once. Start Monday, transform everything, build a new life by the weekend. And that instinct will fail you, reliably, somewhere around Wednesday. B.J. Fogg spent years researching behavior change at Stanford and wrote about it in Tiny Habits, and what he found, over and over again, was that the size of the starting habit matters enormously. The smaller the starting version of the habit, the higher the probability that it survives. So here's a reasonable starting point. 3 habits. Just 3. This week. The first is the 2-minute morning money check. Open your banking app when you wake up, look at your balance, close the app. That's it. The second is the no phone first hour. Whatever you currently do in those first 60 minutes, do it without the phone nearby. The third is the evening expense log. Before you go to sleep, open a notes app and write down what you spent that day. These 3 habits together take about 10 minutes. But what they do is begin to build something that most of the struggling group never had: awareness. Financial awareness that's current, daily, and honest. Next month, add 2 more. Meal planning and 5 extra home-cooked meals per week. Track your food spending for 30 days before and after the change. The number you find will tell you everything you need to know about whether it's worth continuing. By the end of 90 days, layer in the remaining 5. By that point, the first 3 will feel automatic. They won't feel like habits at all, they'll just feel like what you do. And when you calculate the difference in your monthly spending at day 90 versus day 1, most people in this situation find somewhere between $300 and $500 freed up per month, not from earning more, but from stopping the invisible leaks that were running unexamined the whole time. Let me come back to those 50 people one more time. 6 months after I first looked at their routines, I checked back in. The 25 wealth builders had continued doing what they always did, quietly, without drama, adding to what they'd built. Among the struggling group, 5 people had adopted these habits. Not all 10. Some combination of 5 or 6 each, applied imperfectly, adjusted for their real lives. Those 5 people had something measurable to show for it. Their savings rates had doubled. One woman, salaried position, mid-level role, nothing externally different about her circumstances, had gone from saving $0 per month to saving $680 a month. Not from a raise. Not from a side hustle or a lucky investment. From 10 small changes to 6 hours of her day that no one was paying attention to. Your employer controls roughly 8 hours of your day. Algorithms, advertisers, and social pressure are competing for most of the rest. But those 6 hours, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., those are yours. Nobody is paying you for them. Nobody is watching what you do with them. They are the hours that belong entirely to you. And what you do inside them, day after day, quietly and without anyone noticing, determines more about your financial future than your salary does. Pick 3 habits from this list. Write them in the comments, which 3 you're starting with. Not because it creates accountability in some abstract motivational sense, but because naming a specific intention dramatically increases the probability that you actually follow through. That's not a theory, it's been measured. And next week, 13 things that genuinely frugal people never waste money on. Some of them are obvious. A few of them will probably surprise you.